And so I think the drawing part was probably the most important growing up, that was directly connected to what I do. And you're not until getting to college that first year and being in a school where you're starting right in the studio, that's when it clicked. Like, I couldn't think about being in a major where I just was studying for tests or writing papers.
Hey everyone, thanks for listening to another episode of Buildings 2.0. Today, I'm speaking with David Burns, principal at Studios Architecture, an international design practice focused on creating spaces that uplift people and communities. David, thanks for chatting with me today.
Thanks for having me. Excited to talk.
Take us back. So before you designed award-winning projects, master plans, big buildings, interior renovations, civic and educational spaces, there was David the Kid, growing up in Baltimore. You developed a love for architecture, but what was keeping your mind busy in those formative days before you were a big-time architect?
Growing up, I don't think I really understood what architecture meant. I was not in a world of like exposure to it. I was, you say Baltimore is really kind of the suburban experience that was more like, farmland and, occasional trips into Baltimore City. It was not necessarily the kind of immersive architectural experience. And so I don't think I really understood it. And even through like middle school, high school, I was more interested, but still didn't really know what it meant, like as far as what that profession meant. I will say that I was interested in it enough to, I think in 7th or 8th grade, you have to write a paper about what you think you want to do. And I actually ended up picking it architecture. And it was partially because I'd love to draw and I was, reasonably sound at math, and everybody, kind of points you in a direction based on that. And so that kind of led me to thinking more about it as I kind of got through high school. But again, I don't think I fully knew. I still love to draw. That's what keeps me excited about projects and kind of solving problems. And so for me, that's at the heart of kind of thinking through an issue. And so I think the drawing part was probably the most important growing up, that was directly connected to what I do. And you're not until getting to college that first year and being in a school where you're starting right in the studio, that's when it clicked. Like, I couldn't think about being in a major where I just was studying for tests or writing papers, like the whole project-based learning, which really wasn't a thing in school, elementary, middle, high school growing up, really was exciting for me kind of getting into college.
For me, it was a similar story where specifically in undergrad and graduate school, where the studio environment was a little bit more open-ended, where there's no kind of start or stop or no, exam with the, you would get a 79 or 92 on the exam. And it was really, what you would make of it. I'm curious, in those times, was there a specific person that inspired you the most, or perhaps maybe not a person, but rather a lesson in those times that, fast forward in your career, somehow you still hold on to?
I will say there's a high school teacher that I had that I still keep in touch with. He's a close friend. He would be what you would call kind of in high school, the shop teacher. And I think taught me more on the practical side of things about design and problem solving in a way that I thought was, something I hadn't really been exposed to otherwise. And so working with him on properties that he had bought in Baltimore City or on his farm and fixing a barn and things like that, I think got me more interested in what it meant to kind of think about buildings and older buildings. He's still somebody I keep in touch with today. He's, still teaching. We've been talking recently about a potential collaboration on a studio with his class and them building a tiny house. So he's still in that kind of very practical side of what does design mean to, whether it's construction or how to put things together. So it's definitely somebody that has influenced me over the years. And we've had an ongoing dialogue about projects and things that he's working on, things that I'm working on.
There's architects that focus on certain types of properties, whether it's, commercial office or residential. In your career, you've been able to have your hands on everything from civic projects to educational ones to commercial to everything in between. In those cases, what would you say your product is? Because is it the kinds of questions or your approach? How do you, when addressing so many different property types, what is the product itself?
I think it's about the process and the discovery with the client. And I think that can translate into lots of different work. And so, I think what we learn in certain sectors about efficiency or how people are thinking about space, I think the more we see that as that is informing other types of markets. So I think we've seen a lot of it between hospitality and office recently, really influencing each other. I think on the education side and education and business, I think there's definitely thoughts about how those worlds are more similar in preparing, whether it's university students to the next step. So I think that kind of cross pollination of typologies, and so is important. I think not having those siloed practices where you're only working on one thing, and this, I think there could be subject matter experts in those fields, but I think you have to be able to get outside of that in order to see other perspectives and how other markets or other project types are dealing with similar challenges and taking advantage of them. So I think in a world like ours, where it's a lot about risk, people want to know that if you're going to hire somebody, you want to know that a lot of times that they've done it before. And that's the hard part, is finding the projects that are not just about repeating something, but about doing something different and doing something better. And how do you take from, the learned experience and move into something that's, maybe beyond what you thought you could achieve, whether it's a client or the architect or the rest of the design team. So, but I will say it's a struggle, with certain client types, because that is usually a gating issue, and that gating issue can keep us from certain opportunities.
Would you say perhaps some of the guiding principles, whether it's what's an office or hospitality or whatever it might be, is part of the core principle approach, like risk taking by default?
I would say that, yeah, I think definitely the idea that we're bringing ideas to the table that may not be specific to a certain project typology, but general sensibilities about design and how we're solving things in other realms that can really influence what we do in all of our projects. I think for us, and for me personally, that ability to work at a variety of scales, a variety of project types, a variety of people that kind of get influenced or touched by a potential project that can range, from a tiny 300 square foot, project to a pavilion to some master planning. So I think that scale and seeing the opportunity in a project, how, sometime I'll be fairly small, can still be influential and taking advantage of those.
When you take a look at some of the projects you and your team have designed and accomplished, they're stunning, and the end result is incredible. And I guess I can't help but to think, what process or what questions were asked in the process of making this, of designing this? I'm curious, what exactly? There's a quote, for example, on the website, and it says that from you that says, "I like challenging people to look at things differently. It facilitates a ton of different responses." What does that mean? What does it mean to challenge folks to look at things differently, whether formally or programmatically? What are the questions you're asking that perhaps other folks are maybe missing? I'm curious.
I mean, sometimes the questions, we have to kind of force ourselves to, we may come to a project with a very preconceived notion of what is the right attitude. And I feel like I wouldn't say we're a firm that is about producing millions of options that we okay, you can have it any way, and the client just picks one, but really going through the process with the client and exploring very early what those different strategies might mean. And I think testing and challenging ourselves, if we come at it with a preconceived notion of it should look like this, or it should be organized like this. Okay, well, what if it wasn't? Like, what are the other strategies and what might be the benefits of doing that? And all kind of trying to get back to what are the drivers of what's going to make this project successful, what's going to be success for the inhabitants, the occupants, and trying to evaluate it that way. And so sometimes it really pushes us to look at it almost forcibly. Okay, we've looked at these three schemes. They look very similar. Like, what is the opposite of it? What would you do that's totally different? And are there potential benefits of that we can pull from? So, I think not always the straightforward path of the kind of the most logical is always the right solution, but it takes a little while to get there, whether it's internally within our studio or with a client, especially with a client, if they also have a notion of, oh, I came to you because I wanted this. Sometimes that's where you end up. Sometimes you can take them on that trip and say, okay, we looked at that and we've looked at these other strategies, and we think there's some potential benefits that we want to explore here, whether it's better energy of the project or a better kind of result, whether it's economically, sustainably, and have that conversation with them to get to that result.
I want to pose a scenario, and perhaps I'll zoom out to maybe zoom back in, but you and I are both in New York. Commercial real estate right now seems to be facing a bit of a perfect storm where put ourselves in the shoes of a commercial landlord. Let's say a 20, 30 story office building right now. Between high interest rates, high construction costs, changing paradigms in the way that we lease office spaces, all the while facing kind of record breaking demand for housing. As a commercial landlord, what questions should I be asking myself about my building right now? If I'm sitting on, let's say, a 20, 30 story office building in Midtown Manhattan, seeing that folks are not necessarily rushing to come back to my Class B building, how do I think through this?
We're seeing a couple of different paths, and we're kind of actually exploring these with some actual clients right now. And we have a history of working in older buildings in the city and kind of helping reinvent them. So that's kind of part of our, a heavy part of our practice here in New York. I think the different potential questions that you're asking, that the kind of owners are asking themselves, is the level of reinvention within the confines of the use and the infrastructure of the building, and what are the sometimes potential incremental changes can be made to transform a property. We went from trying to create the largest format floors possible in buildings and combining buildings to create these kind of broad expanses that would appeal to large tech that wanted more and more space. I think what you're seeing is the need for these buildings to kind of rethink and think about a community of smaller spaces, and what does that community need to support itself and get people excited about being there. I think those types of projects we're seeing a lot of. And so it's, the single floor tenant, or we're splitting floors into multiple tenants and creating those hubs of activity in the building that leverage outdoor space. And I think all that is done in a reasonably kind of cost-effective manner, but really rethinking a building kind of, at least from the experience from the ground up, in a kind of a branded experience or something that is very specific. And so the user feels like they're part of something versus just any anonymous person coming to their office and through their anonymous lobby and onto their floor. And so
Right.
I would put that in probably the category of not as heavy an investment. I think there are other strategies that hit at the other end, which is, okay, what is the right use for this building? Can this building be, the big takeaways, I think, over the last couple of years were, okay, everybody was trying to figure out where that next life science hub was going to be. Certain developers have kind of locked in on that, and they've started to define certain areas of the city that build a little bit of energy around them. Or is there other uses? Are there uses for, whether they be medical or university? Those campuses in the city are growing pretty rapidly and looking for space. So seeing those as opportunities. And some of these buildings, function fairly well for that. And I think at the farthest end is, okay, in a realm of changing the use to conversion to residential, I think the challenge for some of those owners is the biggest leap. They've already got a lot of money held up in a building, and you've got to go pretty far to get it there as far as the level of investment for that type of change. If the building kind of supports it naturally from the size and scale of the floors, the district, is it actually viable from a zoning standpoint, even though there's kind of been easing and this kind of city of yes mentality of pushing things forward for these conversions, there's still a lot of work to be done. And so, those can be minimum, put as many units in. They may not be the best units, but put them in there and they're going to rent because of the neighborhood they're in or the demand, to projects that I'm hoping where we're getting is those projects turn into also more aspirational projects as the financing or the kind of value of the assets kind of rebalance themselves. It still means there's a lot of capital that needs to be put into them. And so I think that's the hurdle right now, is that the capital doesn't necessarily meet the final kind of return. And so between how do you incentivize it, how do you, push for, because my worry is that all the kind of chopping up into small apartments in the financial district are going to lead to like a little bit of backlash. I mean, right now I think they're good products because there's a need there, but ultimately making the most hospitable, the best places to live. Like, how do we explore that? And I think some of that's going to have to come with through incentivizing it in a way that can make these projects a little bit more friendly to their inhabitants.
I think your instincts are right. I can't help but to think, like, say 10, 20 years from now, we'll be walking down Friday and these kind of, former office buildings turned, apartments. And I guess it's kind of a knee-jerk reaction to the obvious, which is we need more housing. But I can't help but to imagine 10, 20 years from now, we're gonna be like, oh, those weird layout apartments were a very specific moment in time, and we just did not have enough, so we had to, just
Right.
cram them wherever. And you mentioned, the importance of uses. I guess for most Class B, maybe Class C buildings in New York, you've got this kind of traditional retail on the bottom, I guess housing on top. With office buildings, you just got retail and office on top. For the most part, obviously, that's not true for all. But when converting from office to resi does not make sense, I'm just curious, have you come across examples as to other uses? I'm sure there's conversations about hybrid work and maybe downsizing offices, but are there just other emerging uses that we maybe just aren't putting on the table?
I think it's a good question. It's every landlord is kind of poking, trying to find who's going to be that answer for them, depending on the neighborhood they might be in. I do think there are certain areas of the city where you would think that the market is kind of really soft for office, but I think in some of these buildings that have been rethought as kind of an ecosystem for smaller tenants, I think those are thriving and they're moving pretty fast as far as the lease ups. I do think there's the challenge with the larger question of conversion is that kind of occupancy and the inability of somebody to really free up a whole building and do the work for 2 to 3 years to make the conversion happen. And so the cost of that, if the building is occupied and you're vacating tenants, becomes hard to overcome. And so thinking about how buildings can be more strategic of allowing for potential conversions of parts of buildings is something I think is going to be more aggressively studied in some of these to get uses on floors. I think the other uses, student housing, I still think is a big opportunity there that still falls into the same similar challenges to the residential conversion, with maybe a little bit more wiggle room because of the difference between a dorm unit and a residential unit. And so some of the restrictions on if you have a kitchenette or something that doesn't necessarily in a dorm room need to have that access to natural ventilation and daylight, whereas in a residential unit, it's more restrictive. So I think those are other options for folks. And obviously with the markets like around NYU, whether that's in Brooklyn or here in the city or other, campuses, I think there's going to be more need for that. And we're seeing, kind of hearing of that, whether it's hotels that have, are not faring well that are converting to that, or looking at office uses converting to that.
In regards of the ingredients themselves, the things and stuff and programs and technology that make up, let's call it the commercial office, just to stay on this subject for some time today, what are corporate, workplace strategists asking? Like what would make a successful space today? And I imagine it's some combination of tech and different kinds of spaces, but what are those ingredients today?
I think it's something that everyone is looking at. I think there have been a couple of, I think, larger topics of, how to, I think from a landlord side, how to amenitize a space where people are excited to be in the office and bringing people to the office. I don't think that that's ultimately the only thing that's going to resolve it. I think on the tenant side, I think people are also thinking of how they're using the space and we're seeing some clients that were hesitant and always traditionally a 1-to-1 desking ratio for employee, looking at strategies of while they're kind of upping their in-office need kind of mandates, they're also studying kind of a less than 1-to-1 desking ratio, which means either a percentage or all of the workspace is hybrid, where you're able to reserve a desk depending on where you need to be that day. I think that idea of flexibility and movement, we have it in our office. We did this, we renovated during COVID, and, everybody has a reservation that they set up for each day that they're in the office, and you kind of can reorganize your teams based on the need at that point in time. I think those are big kind of components, both from the amenity and the landlord side, or the larger tenant. If you're over a certain square footage, you're going to have that kind of baked into your program, or on the kind of tenant side of how they're using space and providing that variety of space for people to work from, because that's what people are demanding.
It's not awesome. As you're putting the pieces together in how we design buildings, you're also designing a firm at the same time. You're growing a firm, and it's just the kind of the business of architecture in and of itself is fairly difficult, let alone designing and putting up buildings. How do you think about that? Have things changed in the 20 years of maybe what a young architecture grad looks for today versus say 10,
Mhm.
20 years ago? How do you think about that?
I think that's true. I mean, I think, maybe 20 years ago, it was you were expected to go in an office, get paid next to nothing, and work all hours of the day as this kind of rite of passage. And coming from architecture school, it felt okay because you were used to doing that. And so it was like, that was part of the culture. I think we really pushed back on that, and the idea that people need to have a sense of balance in their lives, and there's just a set, there's an aspect where we want people to understand they're really valued, and we want, it's not just about working ridiculous hours. I mean, we all have deadlines. We all have moments where we can see that if, hey, I'm really excited to be doing this, I need to kind of put a couple more hours into kind of generating some ideas, but it's not a constant. I mean, from my career very early on, even in the Paris office, I remember just being there all the time. At that point in my life, I loved it. That was my studio. That was me coming out of college and needing that kind of environment where we're working on competitions, we're pushing things forward. So I think there's still a little bit of that spirit, but I think people need more flexibility. They need more balance. And I think in environments, and maybe this is just because of my experience has been primarily in New York and a little bit in Paris before that, but I think that environment can be really hard. And I think it's getting harder for young people as far as being able to live close to where they work. And so I think those challenges of life, we need to have more respect for, and have more value for the people that are doing the work. And so I think that's something that we've been trying to tackle from a kind of an equity standpoint of making sure that folks are really valued, and that there is an understanding that, one, we're a business and we need to be economically viable, but at the same time, and in that regard, we also need to, everybody, we need people to get fair wages, and they need to be compensated, and they need to be rewarded for their work. And so I think more probably equitable, more value given to real talent at even a junior designer level are definitely apparent. And I think people hopefully feel like they have a voice to talk about it and ask about it when they need to, and encouraging that so that people are aware. And when they feel like something isn't right, they can raise it, and we can have a conversation about it.
I'm sure you've been on the receiving end of questions regarding AI and how it's changing and how it's going to impact, the profession and the business. How do you think about this? I'm sure this is not going to be the first or the second or last time you're asked about this, but as I guess the profession evolves itself, as young professionals start to kind of by default start using generative AI as kind of yet another tool. But how do you think about this in the context of, to your point, running a business?
It's interesting as its use right now is kind of splintered into lots of different fragments of our business, whether it's in the kind of proposal side, or in the image making side, or in the early studies of density side. And, I think there are lots of real great applications where you could get kind of a leg up on studying something, or illustrating something, or even writing something that could have taken bandwidth. And that bandwidth might be better thinking about how to then filter that information and then turn it into something that is kind of credible and exciting, and how does it something that then hits the drivers of what we think a project might want to be achieving. And so I'm excited for it. I don't think we've seen enough on the practical usage outside of, we're using it in our image making, which, saves time. Seeing how it can free up time from early kind of test studies that just put information out there to help frame a conversation or frame, okay, this is what we have to solve for in this project. I don't think it's a solution or it's an answer to what is going to be the appropriate solution. I think it will help inform, but it still requires that person to then take that information and say, okay, this is what we get out of this information, and this is how we move it into a project that is really kind of fitting the client's needs, expectations, hopefully pushing them. And so I think there's this balance of how do we call all that information in a way that's understandable, but then how do we use it to free up ourselves to think about the possibilities. And so kind of that balance of almost analog and digital kind of thinking of, problem solving. And how do we, even though everything is, even when I'm saying analog, it's still, using something else. But
To ask you the question perhaps from a different perspective now, yeah, I'm sure you're going to get a lot more of these, oh, AI is out, what do we do now? Or, the latest tool or methods. But to ask you the question another way, in 10 or 20 years from now, what is likely not going to change about buildings? While I don't know in 5, 10, 20 years from now what tools or methods we're going to be using, but in your experience as an architect, what is likely not going to change about our buildings?
it's a good question about the buildings or about the process. I mean, about the buildings and the end result, there's still a huge investment. There's still a space that is achieving certain functions for its users. And hopefully those functions go beyond just serving the needs and to kind of the aspirations of who those occupants might be. They still are landmarks within a city. They're still, how they integrate with the landscape. I think there's so many things about buildings that are going to be unchanged because of the needs that we have in the basic premise of shelter in all of its varied forms for whatever we have within that shelter. And so I don't think that dramatically changes. I think how we get there changes. I think the material technology changes, and hopefully all for the better as far as moving forward in ways that are sustainable. But I think ultimately the need of that space, can be incredibly practical and incredibly kind of utilitarian almost to the most kind of inspiring or spiritual space you may think of. And I think there's that wide range is still going to exist regardless of how we get there.
David, that was a great way to end it. I think I'm super inspired. I think your perspective on how do we put buildings together, how do we build firms, and what the future is likely going to look like. I think just incredible. I can't wait for part 2. But in the meantime, for folks listening in, can they find you on LinkedIn or website, or just to engage with you further?
I will say I am the least active when it comes to social media, but I am on LinkedIn. But I think the best is to probably look at our website, look at our work, and, keeping that as relevant as possible to what we're doing and our message. So
fantastic. David, thanks so much for your time.
Thank you.